how did the Vikings change Poland?
They didn't. That's the simple answer. But
all right, so it is my very great pleasure to introduce today Dr. Leszek Gardella, who is, for at least another couple of weeks, a researcher and scholar with the National Museum in Denmark, about to become an independent scholar, but who has written widely about various aspects of the Viking Age, including a very fun article I assigned to my students about what Vikings did for their pastimes, which is great because it always puts a little bit of a humanity on the Vikings for my students. But anyways, welcome. It's so nice to meet you. And, we'll probably wander around and talk about a few different things like we always do on this podcast, but ostensibly you're here to talk to us a little bit about Vikings in Slavic lands, which always tends to be kind of a surprise for people that I talk to about Vikings, including my students, because the whole Eastern half seems like it's been kind of a well-kept secret for a while. So anyway, welcome.
Well, thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah. So first, I do want to say something not related to the Slavic stuff. I think your book on women and weapons is brilliant. It's just so, we don't have to talk about that, but it's so thoughtful and so, well, obviously well-researched because that's what you do so well, but it also is measured and professional. And, we were all there when the whole world blew up, when it was declared that there was a female warrior in Birka, Sweden. And I even wrote a piece about it to kind of sort of take to task a few things, some of the scholars. But even more, though, for me, importantly, was the question of why do we really care? Why do we feel so invested in needing there to have been shield maidens so much, that this is going to get this much play? And then your book comes and it's just, it's such a good answer to that whole situation because it's just so reasonable. So thank you for that.
No, thank you so much. That's very kind. And of course, I put a lot of work into that book, and it's been quite a long time in the making because I actually wrote my first article about women and weapons in the Viking Age back in 2013 or 2012, and I had been kind of circling around this topic even before that time when I was working on my PhD between 2008 2012, and this idea of women and weapons just kept growing and popping up, and the book was an opportunity to sum it all up and to give my own sort of personal impression of the material. And this book, as well as every other book that I've written in my career, it's based on my firsthand sort of experience of the material. So I don't, or hardly ever, write about things that I have not seen with my own eyes. I actually take the effort to go and examine the material in various museum collections around Scandinavia and the wider world. So it wasn't just a literature-based, library-based book. I spent a lot of time in the archives, and especially in Norway, to actually look at the stuff. And thank you for saying that so meticulous, because I think it's really important to let the reader know about the data that is actually available and the data that is not available, and about the quality of the data, and about the ways that people have acquired the data, which are often quite controversial. And this is also the case with Birka, of course.
Yeah, I think what I definitely appreciated too was the widening of it, beyond the Birka thing, and even the way you sort of crafted the title of it, not to be like this is about women warriors or whatever. Which I know, you've written about women warriors for like Peter at Medievalist, as I have myself in that medieval warfare magazine that they've had, and trying to contextualize these people, but it's broader than this. And I have my students, which I'm like buried under grading right now, of these chapter essays that they write, because we put together an edited volume on the Viking Age. And so I have even students where it's nothing about the women warriors per se, but about like burial practices or something. I'm like, here, read this section out of Leszek's book, because it gives good information about all of the considerations we have to make when we talk about things that we find buried with people. And so it goes way beyond just the women and weapons type of issue.
Yeah, and I actually really enjoyed writing there's a chapter that looks at the idea of the armed woman in all kinds of cultural contexts. And of course, that chapter only, just scratches the surface, but I wanted to show that, there are different manifestations of this idea across the globe, from Africa through Europe to Asia, and different understandings of this phenomenon. So that was a fun chapter to write. And also different, I was particularly, you mentioned the war earlier, the First World War, but I'm also interested in the history of the Second World War, because it's just so relevant to my world, to where I come from. But in writing this Women and Weapons book, I dug into the history of the Warsaw Uprising, and the histories of women who fought in that uprising, and how they understood themselves, and how, you'd have women do exactly the same things, and some of them would consider themselves as soldiers, whereas others would just see themselves as paramedics, or just saw it as their duty, as their obligation, as their patriotic concern to try and help the best they can. So
the humility of the Second World War generation, a lot of times, right? Like, I was just doing my job,
Well, that was also used to justify a lot of atrocity. I was just following orders. It's a double-edged sword, that one.
Yeah, that's true. Well, so when we talk about a couple of things then with the Vikings in Slavic places, first off, as the boundaries get drawn and redrawn over history, so like maybe just contextualize for the audience when we say Vikings in Slavic lands, like where that would have been specifically during the Viking Age. And then speaking to the issue with the artifacts and stuff, what types of things have been found in those places, and how do they maybe differ or not from, what we know about, say, the western half of the Viking world?
Yeah, sure. Let's start with the geography and the ethnic problem. So the Slavic world is a pretty vast world, and the Slavs, it's a term that defines a very diverse ethnic group, and the Slavs are essentially I think they're actually the largest ethno-linguistic group in Europe. And if we were to look at the Slavs today, they can be divided into at least three branches. So you have the Western Slavs, you have the Eastern Slavs, and you have the Southern Slavs. And all these Slavic groups back in the Viking Age had various kinds of interactions with the Northern world. What I do and what I specialize in is the Western Slavic world. And the Western Slavs essentially occupied an area from what is today northeastern and northwestern Germany, all the way to the borders, to today's borders of Poland and Russia and Belarus and Ukraine. This is more or less the geographical span of the Western Slavic world. Now, anything to the east from today's borders of Poland, that is the Eastern Slavic world. So countries like Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, the inhabitants of those territories back in the Viking Age would have been considered as the Eastern Slavs, and they are today also considered as the Eastern Slavs. And anything to the south from Slovakia and Czech Republic today, the inhabitants of those areas would be regarded as the Southern Slavs. And the distinction between the Eastern and the Western and the Southern Slavs lies in different material culture, of course, certain differences in language, certain differences in religion and religious expression. One of the major differences between the Western Slavic world and the Eastern Slavic world is that at the time of religious conversion, the Western Slavs accepted Roman Christianity, whereas the Eastern Slavs accepted this Greek Orthodox way, and it is the dominant variant of Christianity still today in those areas. And this, of course, affected culture, script, language, and many other things. So this is more or less roughly the geography. When it comes to the differences between the Slavic material culture and the Scandinavian material culture, well, there are many, of course. But on the most basic level, I think the sort of survival and subsistence strategies in the Slavic world and Scandinavia were not much different. And you could never really say that, one cultural group was more civilized or advanced than the other. They were all roughly at the same sort of civilizational level in the Viking Age. So when the first Scandinavian Viking Age migrants came to the territories of what is today Poland, this was not a barren land. This was already a land that had its culture, its architecture. It was not uninhabited. So there was a lot going on already back then.
Do we know what the etymology of the word Slav, where the name Slav comes from?
Yeah, that's a good question and an interesting one too. There are different opinions about this, but I think, at least to me, one of the more convincing ones is that the word Slav comes from the word słowo or slovo in other Slavic languages. In Polish, it's słowo, and the word słowo means word. So it's basically it denotes people who can speak the same language, who know the word, who know how to communicate among themselves, which is really interesting because the Polish word for Germans is Niemcy, which means people who are mute, who cannot speak our language. So it's about the ability to communicate and the ability to communicate in the same speech, basically. Of course, I kind of assume that your question goes to the sort of synonymity of the word Slavs and slaves, because that is also sometimes part of the debate. And there have been some suggestions that the term slave comes from the word Slav because there were so many Slavic slaves in the Viking Age. And that is possible. That is possible because human trafficking and trade in humans was a widely practiced endeavor back in the Viking Age. We have there's a lot of discussion in international academia, but also in Polish academia, about how the first rulers of the founding dynasty, the Piast dynasty, managed to organize their state and build all these magnificent strongholds, which we have thousands. And one answer to this is because slaves did it, because slavery was on such a high level in this part of the world. Yeah,
no, especially among the Vikings, as we continually expand upon. It's that was a major driver of their economy, as we understand it. That forced labor. I think the idea that the name Slav contributed to basically the root of the word slave in English, at least. I'll say I don't think that's true in French. I think the French word for slave is a Latin root, but for English, that's generally an accepted as fact. Oh yeah, I mean, I've heard it thrown out there like it was just consensus, undisputed. But then you bringing up that maybe not, oh well, that's on par with everything we know about the Viking Age.
The root of the word is not that these people were slaves and then hence they are now called Slavs. It's the other way around.
Right. Yeah.
It's the same. Yes. If you look at toponyms in for example, in Poland, there are place names that possibly refer to different ethnic groups that were settled in specific areas. So there are, for example, settlements called Prusy, which refers to the Prussians, the Baltic Prussians, from the Viking Age. So there were slaves of different ethnicities. There were Scandinavian slaves, Baltic slaves, Slavic slaves, all kinds. Yeah.
If there's one thing we can say about the Vikings, they did not discriminate on who they brought in as slaves.
Yeah.
So I think it's interesting to look at, I mean, we keep talking about the Viking Age as this singular thing. And I mean, for my money, like the more I study this, and we all know, we can look at Google any map about the Viking expansion and see how far and wide they went and into some of these areas east as you're talking about, but of course in the West as well. And I just think so much that we should just be talking in terms of Viking ages. You know what I mean? Because there were different things going on in different parts of that world, even though, the main, protagonist or antagonist, who, depending on who you are, were these Norse people. But, it's so difficult, I think, anymore to talk about like singular motivations, ways of being in the world, what they were doing. I mean, obviously there are some commonalities in things, as far as trade and so the slaving issue is a big deal, I think. But I mean, some of it, it's just, to me, like you're saying, I mean, in those more Eastern places I try to get my students to understand this as well. It's like, look at, sort of isolated Lindisfarne versus places where trade networks have existed for thousands of years, and it's multi-ethnic and multicultural and whatever, so that they have to figure out different ways of being. I mean, the Vikings who went there.
Say is that the more I research this part of history, the Viking Age, the more I kind of begin to dislike the term Vikings and the Viking Age, and I try not to use it when I in some of my latest writings I almost hardly ever use the term Vikings, and I especially sort of dislike this idea that the term Viking has, in the work of some scholars, become synonymous with Scandinavians, or kind of exclusive for Scandinavians. I think it's a misunderstanding of the term. And you said the Viking Age versus Viking ages. Yeah, because the world was vast. It was as it is today, and there were things going on in the West, in the East, in the North, in the South, on various scales. And I think also our impression of the role of Scandinavians in the so-called Viking Age is perhaps blown out of proportion. It's not to say that it never happened or they never, invaded all those places, but in reading the text, we get this impression that it's, these Norse people coming and attacking, and it's only them, and they are the fury of the gods or whatever. But it's mainly just because the sources that illuminate those events are more sort of prominent or more easily accessible, or that they have simply survived to our day. And also because we have the wonderful, Scandinavian Old Norse sagas and so on that tell us so much about these individuals, and we don't have the same kind of evidence for other groups that were equally warrior-like back in the same period. And I'm talking about the Slavs, for instance, or the Baltic peoples, or all the nomads of Eurasia. They were also a force to be reckoned with, I think.
I love that point, because we had a fantastic conversation with Dr. Matthew Panesi from I forget the university. Anyway,
Ohio Dominican. He's
Ohio Dominican. And he, right at the beginning of the conversation, he said that he had spent his entire, hang on, but before I dive into that, so his focus is 8th and 9th century monasticism, which is ground zero for Viking invasions from a Viking historian perspective, right? Like when I look at it, I think, oh, the Vikings were a big deal. And he said he spent his whole career ignoring the Vikings because at the end of the day, they really didn't have much of an impact. They attacked a couple of monasteries on the coast out of thousands and thousands. There's just all this stuff going on. So really, were they that big of a deal? And to him, he could make an entire career studying the victims of the Vikings without ever talking about the Vikings. I found that to be really interesting.
Exactly. Well, and another thing is also the production of history, the modern production of history, historical writing, and the creation of the Viking myth, and this Viking myth has been created mainly by, well, Germanic language speaking scholars. And this is also these are also the languages that are widely spoken today, and there's a lot of publications about it. And obviously they are writing about the situation in their respective geographical areas, Scandinavia, England, and elsewhere. So that also creates a certain image.
Yeah, the Anglocentrism of
the Anglocentrism of Viking studies. I think that's let's like be honest and open about this.
We're honest about that all the time on this podcast, aren't we, CJ?
Yeah, I'm French, so I'm always frustrated by that. Where I go, yes, but in France we look at it very differently, huh?
I think Viking studies today need to open up to a much bigger world that has always been out there, but has often been just ignored by academia, also due to various socio-political reasons, the linguistic barrier, and so on. I think you got to look outside the box.
So we CJ and I last week had a conversation. Was it last week already? Yeah, I guess it was.
It was.
It seems like forever ago. I'm still like on jet lag or something here. About, why are the Vikings so popular? And, it's right at the time at the end of my spring quarter here, where that's my last lecture really is, Vikings in modern popular culture, but also just sort of looking at how we look at them and how we engage with that past. And, like what you're saying, talking about the Viking myth, right? I mean, it's like, at the beginning of the term, I'll be like, okay, if I say the word Viking, what do you think of? And of course, all these words come up that are just, right in line with the Viking myth. And then we talk about the fact that the sources are such that they are, and that this is always what has intrigued me, is that when there are gaps, which of course there are, we just fill ourselves into the gaps, right? And want them to be, or create them to be, what we would like. And CJ and I were both talking about how we really enjoyed the piece that you wrote, essentially about the historiography of the Polish scholars for this particular subject, because it's like, just like everything else, it has shifted and changed with the tides and the times, and the way even that they saw Vikings was, of course, how we all are still doing it, and that is whatever they needed them to be at the time. Including, I loved it, in the more recent days, where it's kind of like, well, we've emerged from, the shadows of the post-war era, and we're kind of trying to be our own thing. We're like a century late on beginning to create the national myth, or we were having to rebuild the national myth. And so here we are, we're like, come on, Westerners, we want to be you, so let's latch on to the Vikings like everybody else did. But anyway, I mean, I think that's
now there's a Slavic turn. That's the recent trend, I think. Now we want to be more Slavic, I think.
So are they all going to be Normanists now then?
No. That the Vikings are out of the equation. It's just Slavs and Slavs.
Oh, so okay. Oh, so now we're going to be into Norse denial.
Norse? No. It's more like Slavs are cool. I think that's the.
It's embracing your own.
Embrace your own identity. Yeah.
Well, in the Brittany region of France, La Bretagne, and it was occupied for 3 decades by the Vikings, and that fact was very much ignored for a long time. No one wanted to talk about it because it was a bit of a national. Well, when I say national, I mean for the Bretons, because the Brittany is ethnically and culturally Celtic. Versus, there's a stark contrast between them and the rest of France, for example. And so this idea that they had gained their independence from the Franks only to be invaded by the Vikings the next year. So like I think the first historian to really dive into that was Jean-Christophe Gassard. He's at Quimper, and he opened it up a little bit, but that national narrative that Brittany had at least was like, oh, we fought back the Franks and everything, and so there was a bit of a Norse denial of like, we were occupied again, and that was more embarrassing because the Bretons, or the Bretons, they had repelled the Frankish invasions. So the Franks had never actually invaded. So they were very proud of this idea that, oh, we never succumbed to the weight of this new empire that came in. And when they did become a protectorate, but after that, they gained full independence. And then they were actually physically occupied by the Vikings. It's a kind of a slap in the face, and nobody knew. I mean, as far as I knew when I grew up, nobody ever knew anything about that, right? And it's been coming out recent scholarship, and I was challenged by somebody who's researching this in Western France right now, that there is more interest and research happening on this topic in particular now. But yes, for a long time, and it just follows those trends, right? So in Poland, kind of same thing, right?
So they're recreating themselves there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what's happening now is that, well, first of all, I think there is a lot of new, very exciting archaeology that's just coming up, also through big scale excavation campaigns, but also through metal detecting endeavors that are gradually becoming more and more popular across Poland. And over the last couple of years, we have sort of begun to understand that the Slavs had a very kind of sophisticated animal style or zoomorphic art, which only a couple of decades ago was thought to be something foreign, Scandinavian, or something originating from Rus or from some nomadic tribes. Scholars were not quite, there was so little of it that scholars were not quite sure what to do with it. But we now know that this style and this art that involves all kinds of animals, especially snakes and birds and cattle and horses, that this was something that was produced by the Slavs in the Viking Age, and infused with a lot of really interesting cosmological and cosmogonical ideas, and that's really cool. That's when the Slavs become fascinating. Yeah.
Where are these things being found primarily?
Primarily in the province of Greater Poland, as it is called, so the area around today's city of Poznań, that is central western Poland. That's more or less the location, and this was also the place where the Piast state, so the state organized by the first ruling dynasty, was born. Well, no surprise, because probably this art was in one way or another initiated by the creators of the state, or somehow commissioned by them. So this is where we find it, and we also find it in Pomerania, that is the coastal area along the Baltic coast, and this was an area that wasn't originally part of the Piast state, but the Piasts were, of course, very interested in gaining access to the sea, because that, of course, opened up a whole bigger world of trade and contacts, and also it was the Baltic Sea was a motorway to Scandinavia and other countries or lands around the sea. So so we find it there as well, but mainly in Greater Poland.
And so it's kind of visually. I mean, I haven't seen any of the pieces, but like visual.
I have one here. It's a replica.
Really? Oh wow! Oh,
yeah.
Cool.
So it's something like this. This is one of the most right now iconic objects that we can. It is a spur. Yes. It is a spur.
Wow. Okay. What? Who made this for you?
I know people who make beautiful things. This one was made by an artist called Tomasz Czyszczoń. He's a professional reenactor and a professional jeweler, and I commissioned this object from him, and it's based on an original find from Pomerania, actually, from a Viking Age 10th, 11th century cemetery in a place called Ciepłe. not far away from Gdańsk. If you know Gdańsk,
yeah.
it's a little bit to the south from Gdańsk.
Okay, well, so
that
makes
it's made of copper alloy, and it has these little bells that produce sound, and a lot of animals. So you can see a horse on the goad, and you can see cattle on the arms of the spur. Then on the strap, you can see some bird-like creatures, which I actually think are not really birds, but they're a kind of animal hybrid creatures that combine the properties of snakes and birds. So that's like a flying serpent type of
Those are called dragons, Leszek.
Yeah. In the Slavic world, they can be called dragons, but there's also a very specific term for them in folklore, and this is the term is żmi, and this is a snake that flies, but it also combines elements of the physique of birds, or especially eagles. So it's like a snake could be a snake with eagle wings or feathers. So
yeah,
cool stuff.
that's
and
interesting. Go ahead.
You have the slider with a swastika motif. So that's probably the sun, because the interpretation of the entire object is that it's not only a high status item, but it's also a kind of a early medieval Viking Age Slavic comic book. And I don't know if we can get into details here, but in short, I think it's a model of the Slavic cosmos, or how they imagined their world, and especially the afterlife. So the horse here is a creature that travels between the worlds and is a carrier of souls. And in Slavic belief, horses had this capacity to transport, in many cultures actually, to transport souls into the other world. And the cattle here, probably on an island, because you can see this wavy pattern.
Yeah.
They are representations of human souls on an island in the other world. And then this part here, the strap, is the horizon, and the disc with the swastika is obviously the sun that travels up and down and up and down. So it's the cycle of life. So there's a lot of cool stuff going on here.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. Because I was going to ask, without seeing that, was going to ask about, just the visual nature of it when you're talking about sort of the more kind of pan-Germanic, Hiberno-Saxon, animal interlace, all of that kind of stuff, that it is a lot of art from that period of time, not just Viking or Norse or what have you, but the little wavy bit on the bottom kind of reminds a lot of that.
Yeah, that's the interlace motif. It's a popular motif, but this particular design is a design that we can associate with the Western Slavic world, and then in the Romanesque art it also appears. So it has a pretty wide span, so to say. Yeah.
Okay, so
Go ahead.
Go ahead, CJ.
I just wanted to ask briefly, with the Vikings, for example, their cosmology, we have sagas that help to inform us. Where does our understanding of the Western Slavic cosmology come from?
Yeah, that's a great question. And where does it come from? I think it also comes from our imagination today, largely, because of course it's a bit of a joke, but of course the sagas and the Eddas, they provide us with the best sort of textual evidence of possible Norse beliefs and their understanding of the cosmos, of the gods, the stories of the gods, and so on. And unfortunately, we don't have anything like that for the Western Slavic world. There are no Western Slavic Eddas or Western Slavic sagas. And the reason is that many of these Slavs in the Viking Age were either illiterate or unwilling to record their stories in writing. So all we know about their belief system comes from the writings of external observers, that is, Christian clergy, who often seem to misunderstand things or just manipulate them in one way or another, and often speak of the Slavic religion in sort of dismissive way and condemning it, because of course they're Christians, so they cannot say anything nice about pagan beliefs and pagan practices. And then we also have some information from Arabic sources, and then all we can rely on is the archaeology, which, as you can see, is quite evocative in itself, and then from folklore. So basically, when I said it, our knowledge of Slavic beliefs comes from our imagination. It's the imagination of scholars who try to put all these scattered and very fragmented sources together. So you have these very patchy medieval Latin, Arabic texts that say a little bit about it. Then we have the archaeology, and then we have folklore. But of course, the folkloristic material is very late. It's very far removed from the reality it claims to describe. So, these are sources from the 19th and 20th century, and you have to always be very careful in using them. In trying to reconstruct the sort of the basic myths, most researchers who focus on Slavic religion, they kind of talk about this one origin myth, or the Genesis myth, which appears in folklore in sort of convoluted forms. But of course, all these folkloristic accounts, they don't include the names of Slavic deities that we know from medieval texts. Instead, they substitute them for Christian names. So instead of, let's say, the god Perun and the Veles, you have the god and the devil, and that is how they deal with it. So the Slavic myths that we have in folklore are Christianized, or are clad in Christian clothes. So you first have to peel this layer and then try and dig deeper and deeper into them to get the gist of it. But the belief system was definitely quite elaborate and quite sophisticated. So, like in Scandinavia, they had a whole variety of gods responsible for different things. Then there was a whole world of supernatural beings that could do things for you or against you. And then people practiced all kinds of rituals to, in one way or another, address or control these forces. And this could include acts of sacrifice and worship.
So are most of the artifacts that are being found over there primarily grave goods, or are you not having any sort of, like they do in England, metal detectorists to sort of, finding hoards or whatever just in farmers' fields, but these are actual like grave sites or something?
Well, the finds that we have come from different contexts. So obviously graves are one of the best sources that we have. The major difference between the Slavic burial custom, or the Western Slavic burial custom, and the Scandinavian burial customs at large is that Slavic graves are, as a rule, poorer in terms of the number of, or the types of objects that end up in graves. So there's fewer finds, especially finds of metal. We don't really know why. Maybe there was some sort of a taboo. Maybe these finds were sort of circulated or distributed among the mourners. We usually don't find graves as rich as those that are normally found in, for instance, in Viking Age Norway, where you have swords and several shields and spearheads, and that is the standard. That is not the standard in the Western Slavic world. That is an exceptional thing. But then, we have finds, of course, also from settlement contexts and from strongholds, and these include objects of metal, or various metals, and clay and wood. Quite a lot of interesting material over the last years has been found in the watery contexts, so lakes especially. And there seems to have been a practice among the Western Slavs which involved depositing weapons in lakes. We don't really know how and why. This could be the result of some sort of battle on the lake in winter over a frozen lake, but I think it's more likely that people deliberately would throw expensive military equipment into lakes and rivers. But again, we don't really know why. Is it to gain something from the gods or supernatural beings? Is it an act of thanksgiving? One of my ideas is that we could be actually looking at a practice related to funerals, that this could be some sort of an extension of the funerary practice, where you don't bury the same objects in the grave, in the ground, but you somehow have to send them to the other world through water. Or even that you actually cremate your dead and then deposit their cremains together with all the metal stuff that they may have needed or used in life, or may need in the afterlife, and you throw it into the water. But we will never know. But what we do know is there is a lot of really nice stuff in lakes. Yeah.
That doesn't, because I was just going to say, it just reminded me of, like, these scenes in TV movies and stuff where, like, some person's doing some illicit, like drug dealing or whatever, then they get rid of their burner cell phone and they throw it in the river or something. Yeah. I mean, it's a way to, like, get rid of unwanted contraband. But back in those times, I mean, if you had decent weapons, like, wouldn't you be kind of stupid to be just tossing them in the water, right? Which then, to me, suggests that there's something more important going on there. Like
there's just too much. There's too much of this material. There's one lake known as the Lednica Lake, which is about 50 kilometers to the west from Poznań, and it actually has the largest collection of Viking Age weapons from a single site in Europe. And these are just hundreds of axes, spearheads, swords. There's a complete chainmail, a helmet. It's just too much. And they're sometimes found in interesting configurations. Sometimes they're sort of almost stacked. So it was definitely deliberate, premeditated, and happening over an extended period of time.
And it's a body of water that was there in existence at the time.
Of course.
So it wouldn't have been like this was the weapons manufacturing plant, and then they built it and then they flooded.
And now it's
but there are several islands on the lake, and the largest island had one of the major Piast strongholds, known as Ostrów Lednicki, and this was also the place where Mieszko, Duke Mieszko, so one of the first historical rulers of Poland, and then his son Bolesław the Brave, they had their seat there, their estate, so to say. So this was a very important place on the map, and the island was connected with the mainland by means of at least two really long and elaborately built bridges, and the bridges were so wide that you could actually have two wagons that would pass by, almost like a long wooden motorway across the lake. So this was an important seat of power. And what is interesting is that the lake is not very deep, so it's about, I don't know, 15 meters or 18 meters at best. So if you're a good diver, you could free dive and pick your weapons from the bottom of the lake if you happen to lose something. But somehow they never did that. The weapons stayed.
Wow, that's really interesting. So how long ago were these things found?
Oh, the excavation campaigns, it's like an ongoing project. So archaeologists come back every year, and there's a big museum that has recently been rebuilt and renovated. So there are underwater archaeological campaigns every single year, and practically every year they find something new.
Was this like original digs, like some of them in the West, like in the 19th century or something?
Yeah. Okay. It's a regular dig.
Because I was going to say, I mean, when you earlier you mentioned now, like the more recent kind of focus is Slavic, but then it seems like, wow, you've got all this interesting stuff there, and you can kind of just start to really sort of dive into it in maybe some more meaningful ways. Then, and that's the point when scholars decide, no, we're not interested in that anymore. What do you think is driving the Slavic thing?
The place is really interesting, and this area is really interesting because there are actually some very high status Scandinavian items found in both in the lake and also on land, so to say. And one of the more interesting finds, we talked about graves earlier. There's a grave in a cemetery that is on the shore of the lake, so not on the island, but on the shore of the lake, so about 100 meters from the island on the shore. And it's a chamber grave of a woman, and she was buried with a very elaborate silver necklace that consisted of a number of so-called kaptorgas, we call them, and these are little silver boxes, sometimes boxes that you can open and you can store amulets, or you can store incense or herbs or whatever you feel like storing in them. But among those evidently Slavic amulets, there was also one pendant in the shape of a cross, and it's a type that we know from Scandinavia, and it's a so-called cross-shaped pendant. And these pendants were most likely produced in Denmark during the reign of Harald the Bluetooth. And there have been some suggestions among scholars that these were not your ordinary pieces of jewelry, but that these were things that would be distributed widely among allies and among people with whom the king or his members of his court shared some diplomatic ties. And this is very interesting in the context of, the chronology of the site and the relations that existed between the Piasts and the Yelling dynasty. We don't quite know who this woman was, but having this kind of object as part of her elaborate necklace, that indicates that, well, she was someone important and probably with some ties to the Scandinavian Danish ruling elite. So that's an interesting find, and there are at least two other cross-shaped pendants like this, also from the same region of Poland. So this also again attests to some contact on a very high level, on an elite level.
Have they been doing the analysis of her, isotopic or something else, that they know she's a Slavic person?
Not yet, unfortunately, but this is a possibility. Yeah, this is a possibility for future research. I don't know. I don't want to guess, but if I were to guess, I'd say she's probably a local, because of most of the amulets that she has are sort of very diagnostically Slavic. This is not something a Scandinavian person would wear, but someone who probably had some ties to Scandinavia, either through marriage or political connections. Yeah.
Wow, that's super interesting.
Well, while we're on the subjects of graves and various artifacts being found from, say it's a Slavic grave, but we're finding so-called, Viking.
It's a kind of an interesting hybrid of,
a hybrid. So it brings up an interesting, and I think this is on topic with the title of this podcast, so at risk of making Peter Griffin laugh, because I'm going to repeat the title in the podcast. I don't know if you don't watch Family Guy, you won't get the joke, but
no, I don't. I'm sorry.
Anyway, whenever you hear the title of a movie in the movie, and it makes him laugh, and anyway. So there's the Grubin colony, which is in what modern day Estonia or Latvia, one of those two. And they have what's one of the interesting features of that find is they have an eastward expansion of Swedes that then early in the Viking Age, they have different graves with different dates. And the earlier graves are more farmers, families, women, children, etc. and then later in the Viking Age, there's a higher and higher percentage of warrior graves until they essentially dominate the graves for that site, which tells us that there was a growing militaristic eastward expansion, and this would have affected the Eastern Slavs, the establishment of Kiev and Rus, etc. As far as the Western Slavs are concerned, so there is a modern tendency to look more at the Slavs, as you mentioned, but what can we say about the Viking Age Scandinavian influence of what is now modern Poland? We'll say the Western Slavs, and I'm going to say it. How did the Vikings change Poland?
They didn't. That's the simple answer. But yeah, to be more serious, the strongest traces of Scandinavian presence that we can see in the archaeological record are known from the coastal areas. So from places like Volyn, which was an important port of trade in the Viking Age, which in some ways is probably associated with the famous saga of the Jomsvikings, which talks about this fearless brotherhood of warriors who resided somewhere in their own fortress, somewhere on the southern coast of the Baltic. Then if you travel further east along the Baltic coast, you will find a very interesting site in more or less central Pomerania, and this site is known as Świelubie. In German, it was called Zfilip. And this is a Viking Age cemetery, a very early one, with material from the 9th and 10th centuries. And you mentioned the site of Grobinia earlier, and the presence of female graves. Well, this is also something that we see here, because among approximately 100 graves, those that have been excavated so far, and not the whole site has not been fully excavated, but those that have been excavated are actually graves with evidently Scandinavian objects, the majority of which are actually female objects. So we have oval brooches, there is a trefoil brooch, there are other items associated with the feminine sort of costume and the female sphere, and no weapons at all, or almost no weapons at all. There's a shield boss and a fragment of a shield handle. So this also tells us something about maybe the first waves of migrants, Viking Age migrants to the southern Baltic coast, that they were perhaps not interested in invasion, but maybe more interested in settlement and trade, and in forming, small diasporic communities. And I would argue that what we can see in Świelubie, but also to a certain extent in Volyn, these are little Scandinavian diasporas and sort of pockets on the southern coast. And then if you go even further to the east, towards Gdańsk and Elbląg, then you will eventually come to this place known as Truso, a place that also appears in the writings of the Anglo-Saxon traveler Wulfstan. He talks about this settlement of Truso. And Truso has been found and then I think positively identified as Truso on the shores of a lake to the south from Elbląg. And this is a very large settlement, probably possessing a sort of semicircular rampart in the style of Hedeby, if you know of the structure of Hedeby. It's kind of similar to Hedeby, with a lot of Scandinavian material from the 9th and 10th century, especially Scandinavian metalwork. These three places, I would say. So Volyn, Świelubie, Truso are some of the main places of Scandinavian activity in the Viking Age, in what is today Poland. And then if you look at the southern part of the country or the central part of the country, at least at the present moment, we don't really have many Scandinavian style objects from that area, which can mean different things. It can mean, on the one hand, well, they were not interested, or the settlement was too dense, or the population was too fierce and they just couldn't invade. Or it can simply mean that this is the sort of archaeological status quo, and we still just haven't found the material that is there. And I lean kind of to the latter version, because in contrast to what is going on in Scandinavia or the British Isles, with extensive metal detecting campaigns run by amateurs and professionals, metal detecting is still not a popular thing in Poland, and also the law concerning metal detecting is not as liberal as it is in Scandinavia. So in many regards, metal detecting is regarded as an illegal activity, unless you have special permissions from appropriate authorities. And as we know, for example, based on the finds from Denmark and England, metal detecting can dramatically change our understanding of Viking Age. Scandinavian, especially, presence, settlement, activity, and so on, because these are the finds that get left behind when they set up a camp or they travel and so on. Without metal detecting, it just disappears from the radar. We have metal detecting communities in Poland that are either working legally or semi-legally, but it's interesting that most of these societies are actually not interested in prehistoric or medieval material. They're actually interested in Second World War stuff.
Oh,
so
wow.
Belt buckles and badges and all this paraphernalia. So sometimes anything that's sort of older than the Second World War or the early modern times gets discarded or ends up in somebody's drawer, and that is a big problem, because among those finds there can also be finds of Scandinavian, for instance, type. But when we're talking about the possible presence and activity of Vikings per se from Scandinavia in Poland, I would say that the best traces of them are actually in the form of so-called sword scabbard shapes. So this is the decorative element that is attached to the lower end of the sword scabbard, and they were often beautifully decorated, sometimes with zoomorphic motifs or with anthropomorphic motifs. And we have objects like that scattered basically from the north to the south of the country. And these things, they were most likely traveling with people and with warriors. I don't think these were things that people would trade with. This is something that just detaches and falls and gets left behind. So if you map them, you can nicely track the different possible routes they may have taken in the Viking Age. And for warriors, mercenaries, traders, Poland was I think an interesting area, because you have at least two big rivers that take you all the way from the Baltic Sea to the south, and then you can travel by land to the big markets of, for instance, Prague or Kiev. So you have, in the west, you have the Oder River, so the river that today divides roughly Poland and Germany in some parts, and then you have the Vistula River that cuts Poland in more or less in half. And you can take the Vistula River all the way from the Baltic to Krakow, which was another important place on the map. And from Krakow to Kiev, it's not that far. You can take horses, you can take wagons, you can walk. So yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking
there
about
must be more. There must be more of this material. But to come back to your question, what did Scandinavian Vikings do for Poland? They were certainly not the founders of the state. even though such theories existed back in the 19th century. There's no historical, textual, archaeological evidence for that whatsoever. Every once in a while, we have amateur historians who try to argue that, the official vision of history is wrong and that Mieszko was a Scandinavian Viking. But there's just no way to prove this.
I think it's interesting looking at the map, just thinking of what you just said of like, there's got to be so much that just hasn't been found yet, if it's there, because it just seems so obvious to me, as much activity that we even know about in that sort of eastward direction, that, they go like north to Staria, Ladoga, and then down, it cuts straight through Poland. I mean, it's just right there. It just seems to me like it would have been an extraordinarily well-trodden path, And it gets to also like something else that I've been thinking about that I wanted to ask your opinion on, and it's related to this issue of settlement that you were talking about with CJ's question and stuff. And that is the issue that comes up with my students and stuff about using the word colonialism and colonists for the Vikings, which I'm dig my heels in on that. I'm pretty much staunchly like, no, because I understand with my students, the way they're using it is it's freighted with, what colonialism has come to mean just from the last 500 years, right? And so then it's like, well, if the Vikings are going to be part of European history, well, that's part of European history. And I'm like, yeah, but that's anachronistic in my mind to like put that on them. It's like, I'm in Iceland where, it's like, Norse were the indigenous people here. So how do you call that colonialism in the same vein as talking about Christopher Columbus or something? And so I prefer my students to use the term settlement or colony as in its literal meaning of, right, just a settlement essentially. But what do you think about that as far as the sort of political and ideological baggage of that with Vikings?
I've just completed a new book called The Vikings in Poland, which is actually my habilitation thesis. So a book you write to become a professor. And I don't use the word colonizers or colonists or colonies at all in this book when talking about Scandinavian presence in Poland. And I talk about migrants, as you say, settlers. I think these are terms that are more neutral and not as charged with meaning as colonists or colonizers. Or I use the term diaspora. I think I actually really like Judith Jesch's book, the Viking Diaspora. Although I know why it's Viking Diaspora because it's just a catchy title, but I kind of would say Norse diaspora or Scandinavian diaspora. I think that's safer to use that term. And the way she defines diasporas or the features of diasporas using the work of sociologists, I think that is nicely that's something that you can nicely transfer or transpose onto the situation of the Viking Age. So these are migrant societies that build new homes basically in a foreign environment, that interact with the locals in various ways, sometimes in peaceful ways, sometimes in hostile ways, sometimes there's trade involved, that after a while they perhaps form hybrid identities where they in one way adapt and in one way change and use certain elements of that new area, new culture, while maintaining others. I think the diasporic communities, I think that is something that we can talk about when talking about Scandinavian presence in Poland.
Although to play devil's advocate, Terry, I was just gonna to play devil's advocate, thinking of the Viking Age warrior culture, which parallels other cultures at the time. Let's say the Franks, right? They had a very strong warrior culture. We know historically militaristic societies are inherently expansionist, because how they keep their retinues on board is by conquering, gaining wealth from that. You can't contain a militaristic society in a geographic area because they will just eat themselves alive. And so thinking back to the Jomsvikings, for example, or, you know, all of these pieces of evidence that we have for a strong militaristic culture in Scandinavia, it makes sense to me that part of that diaspora was driven by a cultural imperative to conquer, which so then if we take that and you know, bring back the word colonialism, it's not too far off. I don't think that you know, so maybe like conquering or like expansionism, those would be words that we could apply to that. I'm with you, Terry. I think colonialism refers to a very specific place, you know, in time, which I don't think is applicable to the Vikings at all. But in terms of, you know, the word diaspora, I think is applicable for, say, Iceland, Greenland, you know, places that were the coast of Ireland, but in other places where it was a hostile takeover, perhaps not as applicable. I'm just playing a little bit of devil's advocate there, but
yeah, well, I think it's probably also a uniquely kind of American perspective as well, especially, you know, from my students' point of view, and especially when they run into in the academy nowadays, you know, in my mind, you know, kind of trendy things like, you know, post-colonial studies or whatever, where it's just, it becomes, for me, and this is just a personal opinion, it just becomes this kind of trope then where they're sort of just trained to think, oh, this is how Europeans acted in the pre-modern world, and it's all sort of bad white people versus, you know, good brown people, and, you know, the takeover, and, you know, so the sort of the interaction with the indigenous peoples is, you know, definitely part of giving, you know, colonialism. It's, you know, all the freighted.
One of the features of diasporas that Judith Yesh mentions in the book is, if I remember correctly, it is also a troubled relationship with host societies. So it can still be a diaspora and can have a sort of troubled relationship. Which can be a hostile, of course. I think it's in the archaeology, it's much easier to find traces of something that looks peaceful settlement than to find traces of conflict. Especially conflict between societies, different ethnic groups or cultural groups, especially in this part of the world. And then how do you archaeologically argue for conflict? You'd have to find a mass grave, for example, chopped up bodies, a burnt stronghold. But then how can you know who burnt it? You know, you often can't, because it's also difficult in talking about Central Western Europe, because you often cannot distinguish warriors from one army from those from the other army, because they use exactly the same equipment. And that is interesting, because that's something I maybe should have mentioned earlier. The Western Slavic military equipment is no different to the equipment used in Scandinavia or the British Isles or Francia. It's exactly the same. If you look further to the east, it's more Eastern. Among the Eastern Slavs, it has these nomadic traits. But the Western Slavic weaponry is exactly the same. So you don't know whose arrowhead this was. You know, were the Slavs attacking themselves, or were they attacked by Scandinavian Vikings? You cannot tell. There's no way of knowing this.
See, and then it gets so that it's less easy to, you know, reduce things down to this very sort of simplified binary of the good or the bad guys came in and did this, the good guys. You know, and it's interesting, I think, in the context of, you know, this, again, this colonial discussion of, there's never really a lot of nuanced discussion or understanding that the people who are the victims supposedly of that kind of colonialist expansion are oftentimes, doing similar types of things within their own communities as to what the outsiders, so come in and do to them, and for us again here or in America, the perspective with the Native Americans, I tell my students, like, I've done a lot of research into the Native American tribes in the region where I live in, the Pacific Northwest, and particularly the Chinook tribe. I mean, I could swap out Chinook for Norse, and there are so many similarities in how those cultures were existing, as far as the types of social hierarchies, the chieftain level status, frequent raiding, enslavement, what would constitute sort of conquest and colonial activity of one tribe over a neighboring tribe, all of it. And yet, in my frustration, it's kind of like, well, but the Europeans, they were just worse. They were, they're just the uber colonialists, and the poor peaceable people over here just trying to live their lives. And here come the Vikings. And it's like, no, it's just not that simple.
Yeah, one thing that we have to also remember, and that is often played down, is that it's not only that Scandinavians went somewhere and raided and settled. It's also other groups from Europe that did exactly the same thing. Yeah. And then Slavs and the Baltic people were among them. You had Baltic pirates as well. You had Slavic pirates as well. There's extensive Slavic settlement in southern Scandinavia, in southern Sweden, on the Danish Isles. There are place names that are evidently Slavic. There is high status and low status Slavic material culture. So the connections went both ways, I think. And I think what we need to do is we have to, I think I would argue for that at least, that we have to abandon this vision that, only the Scandinavian Vikings were the sort of, leaders of this martial militaristic world, and that they were the ones pulling all the strings. I think that is a very biased view.
We've talked a lot about that, going back to Western Europe, which is with the Franks, a Germanic tribe, very militaristic, and in fact one of the reasons for the beginning of the so-called Viking Age, at least in Western Europe, one of the theories is that there was some kind of political retribution, right? Because the leader of the Saxon army that was put down by Charlemagne and then forcibly baptized and drowned in the river, it was Widukind, he was brother-in-law to the King Siegfried of Denmark, right? So these people all knew each other, and they were all fighting each other. Exactly. So it's not like, and
they changed alliances, and they intermarried. It was especially on elite level, it was such a mishmash and such a cultural mix. Yeah.
They all shared in common trait of opportunism.
I think so. Yeah.
Right.
Opportunism, glory, and the desire to be remembered in one way or another.
Yeah.
I was on what is that platform online where you ask questions?
Quora?
Quora, there we go. I don't know why I couldn't think of that today. All right. Good morning, everyone. I'm finally here. No, I was on Quora. I think this was a couple of years ago, and somebody asked the question, why were the Vikings more violent than everybody else? Yeah. And I went in there and gave them this nice long answer of they weren't. In fact, they may have been less violent because it was an age of violence. Everybody was killing everybody. Everybody was trying to, we just, they show up on the world stage pretty much right towards the end of multiples of centuries of Germanic tribes conquering everything else. Right. So it's just one more wave,
Yeah, as an archaeologist and someone who specializes in the study of burials, and I've looked at, thousands of burials from different parts of Europe. And my question, if this was such a violent time, well, where is the violence in the burial record? It's not really there, actually, because the majority of the skeletal remains that we find, they don't have any traces of trauma inflicted by sharp bladed weapons. where are all the bodies from all these invasions and from all all these raids and so on? Where are they? They're not there, or they are occasionally found. Yeah, you have these mass graves, yeah, Repton and so on, but these are just little points on the map. But en masse, where is that? It's just not there.
I think that's funny, if we're getting back kind of full circle then to the Burka grave, because that's obviously one of the things that they've said about that, right? Well, if she's this warrior, why doesn't she have any evidence of?
Yeah, of course. I mean, there's many ways you can die in battle, and that a deadly wound does not have to affect bone. It can be a flesh wound, and you can just bleed out, or they can strangle you or something.
Yeah.
But still, for theoretically a violent time that we think the Viking Age was, there's really not so much evidence of violence.
Right.
I would expect there to be much more, but there isn't really.
Yeah, actually, that's kind
there's
of
evidence of a martial culture. Yeah, they're producing weapons. Yeah, they're producing weapons. If you look at the Slavic worlds, there are literally thousands of strongholds. So that tells us something, that it's a martial society, that it's organized, that you have to have people to build these things for you. Probably they're not doing it willingly. They are probably doing slave work. But yeah, where is real in your face evidence of violence? Not
I think it gets to so many of the assumptions, that we were talking about earlier too, and mentioning that, having referred my students to that section of your book about women and weapons, and just how do you interpret these things that you find as well. And David Zori. Yeah, so he's a friend of mine, and we were having this conversation about actually a grave that was found here in Iceland, where I am and where he worked for many years. And the assumptions that kind of get repeated, and I noticed you mentioned that even in your historiographical essay about scholars, sort of like, oh, this is the party line, and we kind of repeat it. And CJ and I have talked about this with other guests as well. And the grave gets found, and it's got a fully intact skeleton and then two other bodies with it who have been decapitated. And so then it's kind of like, okay, it's the usual trope. Then what we say there is those were slaves who were killed to go, with this other person into the afterlife. And I was joking with David, because he was kind of, talking about it like that. And I said, we have this thing in the United States called a good old fashioned murder-suicide. It's like, I was like, we know where the grave is, David and I. It's in this kind of far-flung, really isolated place in Iceland, which is isolated enough as it is. And I'm like, what if you just got tired of that existence, or, a famine was happening and you're like, we're just not going to make it or something, right? And so then whoever the leader of that household was just decided, I'm just going to be humane and take you out by cutting off your head. And here I'm kind of joking, like this would be funny, but do you know what I mean? It's just like, it just gets so much to this idea of interpretation and how we kind of jump to some of these conclusions. But like you said, where is the evidence of the violence, or necessarily that these were people who were enslaved, that got killed this way to go to the afterlife? I don't know.
Yeah. I would push back a little bit and say, I think anytime there's a martial culture, there's a presumption of violence, to start. I'd say with the Franks, at least, there was a lot of violence, and they bragged about it. They wrote about their battles, and there's one battle in 841 is a battle of succession, the Battle of Fontenoy and Puisaye, where some historians think a third of the entire landowning gentry was killed in that battle, right? So there was a lot of violence, at least in Western Europe, and then if you go to England, every couple of years there's another mass grave that's uncovered. I think there's one at Weymouth, there's one at Repton. So we're finding more and more of these things. So but to your point, you've seen thousands and thousands and thousands of graves, and I just pointed out two, right? So proportionally, it's not
to say that there was no violence, but perhaps we just, in thinking about the Vikings and the Viking Age, we again, as I say, we kind of blow it out of proportion. Yeah, a bit.
Right. Well, we know that, just to draw a parallel with other parts of history, if we go back to the ancient Greeks and they had their, the hoplites, and the phalanx formation, etc. We don't know that much about those things, but we do know that in some of the sources that relate to us how these things worked, they would march up to each other with their spears and shields, and then it was essentially it was less of a battle of blades and more of a battle of wits, where they would just kind of smash into each other, and then one side, like one guy might die, and then everybody else would panic and run, right? And then they would drop their shields and their helmets and everything, and that's why the helmet, the word trophy comes from the Greek word for helmet, because that's what they put on the field. And, hey, we won, but not very many people had to die, right? And so that, because today, I think today we are so desensitized to certain types of violence, particularly, I mean, look at the 20th century where we just massacred everybody. I mean, that was just atrocious. And so that's our recent, our recent experience of violence. But if you go back 1,000 years, very different, right? I mean, it's, first of all, they didn't have the tools to kill people en masse, but at the same time, it's, I definitely see this argument of maybe it wasn't such a violent time. It's just, we're hyper focused on the violent things, right? This would be a fun conversation for a whole different topic, but our modern hyper focus on the violent aspects of this period in history, could that, I think, be
sells, coming back to the Vikings, what sells the Vikings is the violence. Unfortunately, it's like our obsession with violence, and the idea that the Viking is the winner. It's this big, tough guy. He always wins, and he is a he also.
Yeah,
we talked about that last week.
What's really interesting is, and it's also, I also, when I give lectures, I talk to kids and students. There's also this probably Hollywood based idea of your iconic Viking, who is this tall, muscular, blonde guy who is this, like a super boss in a computer game, and he just, runs and kills everything. But in fact, if you look at the skeletons and you look at the lifespan, the average lifespan is some 30 or 40 years. The average body build, these were boys, basically. These were guys standing about 1 meter 60, 70 centimeters tall. Usually, probably skinny. They don't look like, your super bodybuilders. They probably look like your Muay Thai fighters. That's probably the look.
Thanks, Ibn Fadlan.
They look like when they go on their Viking expeditions, they look like teenagers, probably.
I joke because that's the Arab chronicler Ibn Fadlan describes them as tall as palm trees and built like, and the way he describes, and I feel like that's what we in modern times have latched onto. I think the Annals of Fulda also describe a botched raid on Aachen, and they talked about, and that's where they talked about like blue tattoos too. So everybody's like, oh, all the Vikings had tattoos. What? Because they mentioned it once.
Why not? I mean, tattooing is it has been known for a very long time, and all kinds of like bodily modifications. I wouldn't doubt that. We cannot prove it archaeologically, unfortunately, but there's mentions of eye makeup in the sources that speak about Scandinavians, several independent sources. So why not?
I was just pointing out that it's a big leap to take one mention and then say blanket everybody had tattoos. I do think at least the Carolingians had a vested interest in propaganda against Scandinavians because they shared a border with the Danes, right? So a lot of these things that are being relayed to us about them, there's this whole idea that the Vikings were taller than average Europeans at the time, which is, we can't say that, but there is going back to the Annals of Fulda, I think it was the Annals of Fulda, if I may be wrong on that, but there is a Carolingian chronicle that talks about this botched raid, and they describe the slain bodies as being extremely tall, blonde, kind of this trope of Vikings, and that that mention has informed 19th century historians that then popularized it. So now we have this vision of these like tall, but it's just we're misinterpreting Carolingian propaganda to demonize these people who were raiding into their territory. But also there's a vested interest, because I think the Carolingians, being expansionists as they were, and I do believe they expanded into parts of Poland as well, they they were probably planning at some point to invade and subdue, but they're just trying to rally public opinion almost. Well, that wasn't super important to them. Just a thought.
It's probably lucky then for those Western Slavs that Charlemagne had incompetent kids and grandkids.
Okay.
Yeah. Ironically, the son that took over the territories that are in now modern day Poland was Louis the German. So I do have one last thing. I don't want to. We're going to be running over time here, but I do have one question. It's just a curiosity, because I did start my journey into studying the Viking Age in the East. So when I was in college, I did early Russia as a whole course, and we looked at Kievan Rus, etc. And so going back to this question of, when how did the Vikings change Poland? You said not very much at all, if at all. So how much? So if we think about Kievan Rus, the narrative that I recall from studying that portion with the Eastern Slavs was it was a means to an end. It was the Scandinavians trying to get solidified trade relations with the Byzantines, right? Because they weren't particularly interested in the Slavic lands. It was they were trying to get to the Constantinople was their eventual end goal. Do you think that part of the reason there's less, because if you go east, there's a lot more evidence. There's a bigger, first of all, as you mentioned, there's a bigger distinction between the Eastern Slavic artifacts and the Scandinavian, so we can tell the difference better. Whereas with the Western Slavs, we can't really tell the difference because they're using all the same weapons. But do you think part of the reason Vikings may have had less of an impact in Poland has to do with there wasn't anywhere, like I don't know if I'm phrasing this correctly, but like in the East, they're going to Constantinople, but they had nowhere to go in the West. So maybe they just didn't penetrate as far, or didn't have as much of an incentive to go that far.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I've been thinking about the same thing, and I'm not sure I actually have a good answer, because as I mentioned, it's not as convenient as it is when traveling through Russia and Ukraine all the way to Constantinople. But you can make part of that way on the Polish rivers. You can take the Vistula River, and as I said, it will take you at least as far as Krakow, which is far enough. Because from Krakow to today's Ukrainian border, it's about 250 kilometers, around 300 kilometers. So it's really not far, even if you have to ride or walk. Was there nothing of interest in the Polish lands for the Scandinavians? Well, there were no churches to raid, certainly, because this was at least then a holy pagan land and stayed pagan, despite the sort of official Christianization, which, as we know, it takes a while to solidify. But yeah, what the land offered certainly was manpower, probably, hence the slave market. And Mieszko, we think today, was a key player in the European, even greater than European slave trade. So they may have been some sort of intermediaries or in this sort of slave trade, or maybe facilitating this slave trade across very wide territory, the Scandinavians. I think they may have been interested in some of the technology that the Slavs had mastered and that the Scandinavians didn't have. And I'm thinking about the art of building these massive strongholds, because you have to know that, and I'm sure you know that, of course, but it's for our listeners, that before Harald Bluetooth raised those huge Trelleborg-type fortresses, Denmark didn't know this kind of technology, didn't have this kind of technology. And there are traits in those strongholds and in their constructional features that point to the Western Slavic world and to Western Slavic influences, where such strongholds, not exactly of the same design, but of the same sort of idea, had existed before. Moreover, among the artifacts found within those strongholds and around them, there are actually objects of Slavic or Western Slavic provenance. At Trelleborg, for instance, the richest grave in the Trelleborg cemetery is a grave of a foreigner. We don't exactly know where, maybe from Poland, because that's, the isotopic evidence just shows that this is not a local. And this foreigner is buried with a diagnostically Western Slavic axe of a type that is only characteristic for this Western Slavic world. So who was this person? Some sort of, I don't know, Slavic supervisor, master builder, or whatever, perhaps. So maybe, coming back to the question, maybe the Scandinavians were interested in some technology. Maybe they could see that, at least in the 10th century, there is something happening in this part of the world, that there is a new power rising, and this power is conveniently located geographically between the East and the West, between the Etonians and the Rus. And maybe these are people we can, collaborate with, we can communicate with. And this explains why, or may explain why, Svein Forkbeard married Mieszko's daughter. And we know this for a fact. We don't quite know her name because she has different names in different sources, but there are such very high profile ties. Then there is the influx of silver and the astonishing amount of silver hoards in Pomerania and around Poland. And that can also be linked to, for instance, the slave trade, or even wider cross-cultural contacts back in the day. Does that answer your question? I mean,
I appreciate all that. I wonder too if and now we're going down the rabbit hole. But maybe. I wonder too if the Scandinavians and Western Slavs may have had some ties of convenience in regards to going back to the Carolingians and their expansionism. The Carolingians were knocking at the Western Slavs' doorstep, as well as the Danes. And going back to these fortifications that you're talking about, it would make sense that they may have communicated in a manner that would allow Danes then to create these forts to repel this big Christian empire that was quite bellicose. Same with the Western Slavs. So I wonder if there was some pressure there for them to, going back to the idea of maybe they weren't as violent as we thought, that maybe they were working together.
Your allies.
Yeah,
maybe. We also don't quite know if all these so-called strongholds were actually intended as sort of militaristic architecture. Because some of them, for example, don't have any buildings inside, like within the rampart. So they may have been just like gathering points, or even some of them may have been ritual sites. We don't quite know that. Yeah.
Well, it sounds like you have a lot of work cut out for you.
There is a lot of work. Yeah, I think there is.
You won't be.
There is a lot of potential there.
Yeah, that's good. Well, so maybe you'll have to come back some point later and talk with us again.
I'd love to. Yeah, well, I'm hoping to launch a new project about actually Slavic Scandinavian interactions and the presence of Slavic migrants in the north. So if that is successful, I'd be happy to come back and talk more about what the Slavs did for Scandinavia. For the kind of turn the thing around.
Yeah, well, we've already had just that DNA study published not that long ago, right? Talking about the migration going the other way, going to the north, rather than always being the diaspora out. We're having Judith on in the first week in May too, so maybe we can talk with her a little bit about that proposition as well. Great. This diaspora context. So,
awesome.
But thank you. This has been great. It's been so interesting.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for this discussion. I think we've covered a lot of different topics.
Yeah, that's what we usually do, meander all over the place. It's because it's interesting, right, CJ?
Yeah, exactly. One thing leads to the next, and
yeah, exactly. So, well, I'm kind of bummed though you won't be in Denmark when I get there. I was like, oh, maybe I could actually meet you over coffee or something.
We can try somewhere else some other time. I will certainly be around.
Yeah, you're not going to come out the SAA conference. It's in my home city in Portland in a couple of weeks.
No.
Yeah, bummer. Oh. Oh, well.
Well, thanks for coming on. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
And hopefully until the next time.
Yes. Yeah. Take care. Thank you so much.
Great. Have a great evening.
Bye. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.